like my ABCs.
I am James Grimm Desborough. I have been a full-time tabletop RPG designer for about 12 years, doing it freelance for about 15, and I've been gaming in one form or another since I was about 8 or 9.
Hey, I'm Alexander Alternative Roo. I've written one or two books of my own. I've written several stories, several scenarios, different other books, and I've consulted on other pen and paper horror books, which I decided to remain nameless for now because they're not in a position to respond to any of my comments. So, yes. But anyway, we've both been working as Grimm's been more successful in it than I have in the RPG industry for a good few years, and I guess we're fans of it for even longer. And we both brought out horror-specific games. I played some of Grimm's games at conventions, and I found them to be quite interesting. So I guess if I actually have to ask you a question before any of these other questions, like why did you? Is there any reason why you do horror over any other type of game?
It's strange, really, because while I sometimes enjoy horror films and horror books and so on, I wouldn't say I'm a huge particular fan of the genre. But for some reason, when it comes to tabletop gaming in particular, I really enjoy running horror games. I think for the sort of reactions and the other foot dropping to the ground that you get from people, where you get much more reactions. People seem much more invested in horror games. It seems to aid immersion more. People seem to get genuinely afraid for the fates of their characters. So I think that's why I find horror is a good way of hooking in to the player, getting your talons into them and getting good immersion and reactions. And as I've had less and less regular play, I think as we all do as we get older and do much more and more one-off sort of one-shot games or convention games, horror is much better suited to one-off games than a lot of other genres, because that way you can kill players with impunity and it doesn't have a long-term impact on a campaign or anything. So that's some of the reasons. I guess I like the themes. I like the way it gets its hooks into people, and it suits the kind of play that I do more often these days.
Yeah, I guess we're starting with the first talking point, which I think is the most existential talking point. Is what is horror? I mean, what is horror to you?
Horror is that kind of fear, that primal reaction to something. So not necessarily just fear, but also disgust. It's exploring all these darker facets of human emotion and behavior, and almost the kind of reflexive, primitive brain part of us. And in terms of fiction and so on, it's a way of safely exploring these things, which is always going to be fascinating and interesting, I think. So
Yeah. When I was growing up, I was kind of one of those children that you call a morbid child. I kind of like the strange and the not so much gore and so on, but the strange, the weird, the scary, and it's just something I've kind of grown up with because, as you say, it's kind of like a safe environment. I know the word safe space is a bit of a joke now, but it is literally a safe space to do and experience things that you can never get away with. And I know that's pretty typical of a lot of the role-playing genre, but in horror it's very much more so because it gives you license to be a bit stranger and a bit darker.
yes.
I don't usually plug other video creators, but there's a gentleman by the name of Plague of Gripes who's done a whole series on horror, and I suggest people go watch that as well. He's gone into great detail of what is horror, but he's more specifically on video games and films rather than pen and paper role-playing games and so forth. And horror is a good convention game. It takes very little setup. And while you might have a fantasy game on one hand, where people might need to know the entire backstory and so forth of this world to play it, everyone kind of understands what's scary, in a sense. And this will get on to something we'll talk about later, but in the context of pen and paper RPG, I guess, then what is horror in that context? It's a bit of a vague question, but there's horror that's suitable for films and there's horror that's suitable for books. Is there a different type of horror that's suitable for pen and paper RPGs?
Well, it's the medium lends itself to certain kinds of horror. It's very hard to do a jump scare on people in a tabletop game, and it's cheap anyway, so I prefer to avoid those. But what it's good at is the kind of the slow build and the kind of revelation of something horrible. So I think that's why Call of Cthulhu has been so successful, because that's kind of how that works: the slow build up, the investigation, the horror, the evil isn't really revealed until the end, and by that point you've built it up to such a degree that it has an impact. So that's the kind of the default best way to go about horror in tabletop, I think, is that slow build of stuff. The other angle that you can work is the kind of disgust angle. You can describe really grotesque and horrible things, and that can still have a horrifying effect. But the kind of more kinetic, frenetic, the jump scares and the physical panic is something that's very hard to convey in the tabletop game. So that doesn't tend to work as well.
Yeah, I find Call of Cthulhu works really well, just for the simple fact that it's translated from the works of H.P. Lovecraft, who was very good at not telling you a lot of things. So Call of Cthulhu is a game where you don't need to know anything about the Cthulhu mythos at all, because the characters don't, if you get my drift.
I'd say it helps if the players don't. The trouble I find with Call of Cthulhu these days is that usually, even if the characters don't know what's going on, the players are so well steeped in mythos lore and so on that it's very hard to surprise them or hit them with something they don't know, or the slightest hint and they figure out what's going on. So at meta level, they don't necessarily enjoy the game as much.
I ran into that in certain conventions and so forth, with you get Lovecraft enthusiasts, Cthulhu enthusiasts signing up to your games because they want to play it. I found it kind of confused them a bit when I'd start introducing my own made-up elder gods and so forth. They were expecting a Cthulhu experience, I think, rather than a horror experience using the Cthulhu mythos.
Yeah.
That's why I eventually turned to a role-playing game called Cult, which you probably know.
Yeah, we played a lot of that, and I don't know how much I can say, but at various times, various groups I've been aligned with have been supposed to be bringing new versions of Cult, out to be republished, but none of that's come through yet. So I think I'm safe to say, that's all in the past. But Cult's very good. It's a much more old school Clive Barker style horror. I think it owes a lot to Hellraiser. And it's steeped in sort of ancient Jewish Kabbalistic magic and interpretations of reality as well. And it makes for a brilliant game. We ran several pretty successful campaigns of that back in the day. It's definitely worth checking out for something alternative and different that people won't understand straight away.
I do like Cult because a lot of my games involve religious imagery. I don't know why I'm drawn to that, because I'm an atheist outside of games.
That's probably why.
Yes, probably. And I like exploring this ancient, not so much modern religious imagery, but ancient and slightly esoteric things. Like there are certain things, for example, I'll get my tinfoil hat now, but there are certain things that the Catholic Church, for example, has in the Vatican that no one, not that no one knows about, it's just no one really talks about. You know, they're all old books and so forth, and I kind of like to think of, well, what's in those books? You know, why does no one read them? But Cult is very, as well, forgiving when it comes to the darker side of horror, shall we say? You know, the more extreme kind of.
Yeah,
Which is
it's definitely set up for that kind of thing.
it's definitely set up when in the system of Cult, you almost get a sort of benefit for being psychologically damaged as a character.
Mm.
And that allows you to. But what I've found is that I tried to once or twice go down this disgust route, you know, with the rape and dismemberment and so forth and so on. And the players kind of weren't having it, not because they found it offensive, but because they kind of found it cheap in a way.
Mm. Yeah, it definitely can be. I mean, like I was saying with the jump scares that you get more often in video games, you know, that's cheap, and maybe the first one or two get you, or maybe they all get you, but you start to kind of resent it. So disgust can work, but it has to be done well, and it's so easy to go over the top.
Yeah, there's a fine line between pulling off something that is. I hate to use the term offensive, but I can't think of anything else. Well, it is offensive. It's
That's the point.
Yeah,
really.
It's not so much in the I'm offended by that. It's supposed to offend your senses in a way. It's meant to scare, revolt you in some way or so forth. Like I guess leading into the next talking point, and certain things we can go back over, obviously, but it seems to flow into one another. Is that can you or how do you scare people playing a horror game? Because usually a lot of these games are played at conventions or at meetups and so forth, and you don't exactly have the atmosphere to properly scare people who are playing the game. So is it possible, and how do you do it?
I think it is possible, but I couldn't give you any, you know, really good hard and fast rules on how you do it. I mean, like you say, often at conventions and so on, you know, you're in a brightly lit hall, there's people all over the place, you know, you're drowned out by the shouting at the next table, so you can't even do tricks like, you know, sometimes you can lower your voice and kind of draw people in and get everyone leaning forward over the table, and then you can say something revelatory in a louder voice and get a reaction that way. So, you know, in those situations you can't even particularly be theatrical about what you're doing. So what I find, generally speaking, what generally works for me is to spend a good portion of the time getting people into the heads of their characters, getting them established, getting them invested, making them care about the characters and the situation, and then screwing with them, you know, once they've got that investment. And that gives a sense of dread, creates a sense that there's something at stake. And, you know, once they've got attached to their characters or to each other's characters, they don't want to see stuff happen to them. So for me, that's how you get to that point. So it's not exact. You can't really make people genuinely scared. I think you can make them unsettled. You can make them feel a sensation of dread. You can discuss them, provided you don't go over the top. But actual fear, I mean, at the end of the day, you're sat around a table, you know, with handfuls of dice, and immersion only takes you so far. So I think a genuine sense of fear is very hard to bring about.
What I tend to have found quite interesting is that when you're experiencing another form of horror from films or books or so on, you're really experiencing it through the characters. You're reading it, you're observing it. I found when you're running horror games, it's quite interesting to force the players to do something they don't want to do. So it's more, in that sense, you have to bring in the interactive side of things. And whoever came up with the idea of personalized insanity trips for Call of Cthulhu is a genius. Because it's not necessarily scary, but it's a great way of involving the player with their character, because then they have something very personal to that character to work from. especially in an environment like a convention or a one-off game where you're just given a character and it's like, okay, make up that character's personality, make up their
Yeah.
backstory and so on. Or you get dumped 3 pages of A4 about what the character's backstory actually is. And well, we've only got 3 hours to play the game, and I don't really want to read all of this.
Yeah, I did run a game. What I tend to do is to give just enough hooks to cause trouble. So I had a game where all the players were from the same family, on a yacht getting stranded. So I just gave them a bit of background. Like you're this woman's husband. You have certain marital difficulties. This holiday's meant to be to sort them out. You love your children, but this child annoys you way more than this other one, and you never wanted a dog. And then one of the other characters was actually the dog. So that gives you just enough to go on, and it's kind of like almost like setting up for a film. The first 15-20 minutes you kind of get an idea of who the characters are and what their relationships are to each other, and then the bad stuff starts happening. So
well, there's something I wanted to kind of bring up, which I found it doesn't just happen in RPGs. I think films and books are the most guilty for this. And I think someone's operating size equipment or something outside my window, and they picked a great moment for it. But
I can't hear it, so you're okay.
Oh, good. Right, I shouldn't have said anything then. There's 2 types of scary that get it wrong. There's scary for the character, and then there's scary for the viewer. For example, there are things that are scary, but only for that specific character, and for probably a very small minority of the audience watching. They're too specific, and they're directed at a character in the story. Whereas you then have scary for the viewer, which are things like Halloween and so forth, where you see the serial killer or monster or whatever pop up behind the character who doesn't know they're there. Now that's scary for the viewer, but there's a bit of a disconnect there because the character doesn't know they're in any danger. Only the viewer does.
Yeah.
So
that's difficult to do when you've got several players who are all simultaneously audience and characters. But you can mess with people's expectations. So like you can describe something to one of them and describe it differently to the next person, and the next person doesn't see this whatever it is at all. So you can start calling into doubt what's going on. Make yourself as the game's master into an unreliable narrator almost, which is a good way of screwing with people.
Yeah, there is a problem as well that horror games can easily turn into a comedy.
Oh well, all role-playing game sessions can easily turn into a comedy. Yeah. So, that's not necessarily bad. I mean, Evil Dead 2 was fairly comedic, let alone Evil Dead 3. There's plenty of horror elements that draw on comedy or inhabit the same sort of space. I mean, even House of 1,000 Corpses. A lot of people don't like it. But I thought it was quite good. But it contains these kind of weird comedic elements alongside the same kind of visceral disgust and so on that makes for genuine horror. And sometimes it makes it more effective, I think. So like, I think it would be a much lesser film if Captain Spaulding wasn't in it. And he's definitely mostly a comedy element.
Yeah. Well, I think there's it was the Hammer horror that had a tendency to, when something scary would happen, they'd put in a joke right afterwards. Like they'd cut in a joke. And it created this kind of fear leading into a brick wall. Because where the joke might be funny, you're so not expecting a joke after horror.
I think part of the problem there was that the censorship in that era was much more there, much more of a worry. So I think part of that was them trying to kind of diffuse the very sensations and emotions they were trying to build up.
Yeah. There's one quote from, I know I'm bringing Hammer into it, but they've had several interesting quotes that I've used for horror games. And they said when they were brought out, I think it was Dracula, Prince of Darkness. there's a problem with horror films that people start laughing. So you want to put a stop to that as soon as the film starts, or I guess in this case, as soon as the game starts.
Yeah.
You want to make people aware that no, this is going to be scary. You're not supposed to laugh.
Yeah.
It's this weird kind of when you're DMing or GMing a horror game. There's a weird set of emotions that you want to get the players into if you want to run a successful scary game.
Yeah, I think the best way to establish that is to lead by example and to just be kind of super serious and focused from the get-go.
I also think you need a certain type of brain, a certain type of mind to write effective horror. And as cliche as it is, I think a slightly damaged mind writes horror better. I know this is like a weird thing to say, but I've had two experiences writing horror on and off SSRIs, and it's a very different product on either side.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on the same kind of chemicals. I've only just recently come off them, so hopefully I will continue to be well. But I mean, generally, creatively, I find they have a bad effect on my creativity. So, but I can't say I noticed anything specific to horror. I'd be interested in hearing how you think it specifically affected you with regard to that.
Well, when I have a different problem with depression in that mine's purely chemical. In that my brain doesn't absorb enough serotonin, so I have to take SSRIs and so forth. But when I was not on them for a long period of time, I wrote quite effective, quite dark. I kind of became, as people might say, autistic about it. You know, I became very entrenched in the fine details of trying to make horror perfect. As far as it goes in my game, it's like I didn't want someone questioning whether what I was saying was correct or not. It got to the point where I was reading the Quran and the Torah to try and get passages or historical, as those books see it, historical events correct.
Yeah.
Because a lot of my horror revolved around religion. Not sure why, that's just how it happened. I have a lot of Catholic imagery and a lot of Orthodox religious imagery in it, and a lot of things that I kind of use Orthodox because Orthodox religions tend to bring in other sources that more like moderate, more newer versions of the religion usually set aside because they for whatever reason. And that makes it sound and look. That makes the game sound and look a bit more esoteric when the DM knows what they're talking about, and they can say, "Oh no, it's in this passage in the Quran or something." Blah blah blah. The problem is that that's really great for the game, not too great for me as a person. I found the biggest problem with taking antidepressants, and caveat: take your antidepressants. If you have a problem with depression, take your antidepressants. I'm not saying don't.
Oh, yeah, stay on them.
Yeah,
just plan around the effect that they may have on you.
Yeah,
but stay alive.
Yeah, but I found the more I take SSRIs, the less scared of things I become. I don't get scared easily, even before antidepressants. It took very specific things to scare me, and even then, it was just like very, very unsettling. But now, the same things don't even touch the sides. So I found sort of like, if I can put it in this way, when I write a horror game, I tend to take one focal point and then expand outwards from that.
Yeah.
And I usually take the one focal point has to be, okay, I need something scary, and then I need to create a world and a scenario around that scary thing. It's like Hellraiser, the films became about the Cenobites when the book really wasn't.
Yeah.
So they started with the idea of Leviathan and the Cenobites and expanded outwards from that. while taking SSRIs, I find it very hard to find something that's scary and then create a world around it. I've become a bit more methodical, and the problem with that is that you end up kind of just churning things out with no real big personal touch to them.
Yeah, they blunt your sort of emotional highs and lows, and as a consequence, I think sort of your raw creativity is blunted as well. So those of us who are creative and are stuck taking these drugs, I think as a sort of survival mechanism, we become more methodical, and that kind of becomes sort of writing by numbers, which isn't necessarily what you want to do. I mean, you can still produce good content, but that kind of flash of genius is much harder to grab hold of, I think, when you're on them.
Yeah, you have to be able to scare yourself before you can scare others. It's no good writing horror from the perspective of being scared by someone else's work. Your work almost has to scare yourself.
Just curious, have you found that the kind of the central monster or scary thing that you come up with goes too far when you've been on the pills, and then you take the idea and present it to, for want of a better word, normal people? Is it too much?
I guess we could say neurotypical. But in my case, it would be neurotypical because I'm technically neuroatypical because my mind's down to chemicals rather than emotions and so on. My problem is that in this case, the methodicalism devolves into cliche.
Yeah.
So I end up making the horror monsters or just different versions of the horror monsters that have been around for decades, if not centuries. And people are quite quick to associate, oh, this is like this. And I've seen, this monster's like Freddy Krueger, and I've seen so many of the films that I'm completely desensitized to this aspect. And again, I tend to work around monsters rather than I do concepts. Before I took the pills, I worked on like scary or horrific concepts, and then the monsters would come later. And now I seem to focus around the monster, and then the concepts come later. Which isn't
Sort of like monster of the week that you got sometimes on Buffy and so on.
Yeah. And it doesn't quite work well. I guess we can talk about. We touched on it a bit before, but people do get involved in horror RPGs at conventions. What do we talk about? Why you think people get more involved with horror games sometimes than any other game?
Like I said, I think that the fact that horror is very much invested in emotion kind of encourages people to get hooked, to get immersed. And I think in the short scenarios, you know it's going to be high stakes. You know there's going to be no punches pulled, or at least very few punches pulled. So right from the get go, I think the players are more alert and focused to what's going on. So there's that, and I think the typical kind of horror story hooks that you get, while they might be cliched, they're no more or less cliched than you meet an old man in a bar who gives you a quest and a magic ring. That's one kind of cliche. But you are a group of college students out on a back road when your car breaks down. Might be cliche, but it's a good quick hook for getting people into it. So I think it's easier to get into. You're kind of primed to get hooked and invested into your characters, and to immerse yourself. And so I think it's a genre that lends itself to grabbing people and drawing them into playing. Right off the bat. So I think that helps a lot, and that's what gets people involved. Of course, you don't get the kind of long-term involvement that you get in other games that's invested in the campaign and really invested in the characters and their future and planning ahead for how you're going to level up and improve and all the rest. You don't get as involved that way, but you do get involved in the character and the emotions and the scenario and so on.
I've also found that playing a horror game is almost like a social license at conventions to cut loose a bit, to do things and say things you couldn't do in other games. And usually you can assume that the rest of the group is on board too. It's kind of like an unspoken. I don't know if you see this, but I've seen it as kind of like an unspoken rule to be step outside, shall we say, the usual politeness and courtesy of society and conventions to do something a bit different.
I see that more with comedy games, but I think horror games and comedy games actually have a lot in common in terms of GM skills and setup and so on. So I don't think that's that surprising. But yeah, to a degree, I think it lets people feel that they can cut loose and react in character much more boisterously than they might otherwise. So yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, I've only ever had one person completely offended at one of my games to the point where they left, and it surprised me because whenever I put up, for people who don't know, conventions usually work on, you put up if you're running a game, you put up a sign-up sheet or there's some sort of sign-up board or something, and you give a description of your game, and then people sign up underneath and so forth. Well, most of the conventions I've been to, and I've been to a good few, I usually put like big red warning labels on my games that this is basically dank shit. So
Caution, dank memes.
yeah, caution, dank memes ahead. And I guess the person didn't read it because they became a bit offended at some of the things I did in my game, and that became a trend later on, which I don't think we'll go much into in this because it's been gone into several times in other places. But yeah, there seems to be a specific type of group, and I guess with the next question as well, there's a specific type of person that really enjoys horror games. It kind of leads to the next talking point of who plays horror games. Yeah, what type of person?
I don't know. My experience, there's not a particular type, but the kind of gaming groups that I've been with have always been game for anything, really. And I came up during the whole satanic panic and everything else. So a lot of gamers were actually attracted to gaming by the fact that all these people were having conniption fits about it. So you had a lot of metalheads and horror readers and people who like video nasties and that sort of thing, who were actually attracted to gaming because people were condemning it. In some ways, I kind of wish the religious right would start condemning us again because it boosts our popularity. So those are the kind of people that were coming in looking specifically for that sort of thing. But they were just kind of general gamers to me. I mean, this was back in the day when Games Workshop used to play death metal in their shops, over the speakers. So yeah, that's how far back I go. At conventions now, it does tend to be older gamers, I think, who are into the more horror style games. I don't know why that is. Maybe there's a degree of maturity and a desire to play something new, something different, get unconventional experiences. And horror games do, I think, tend to offer more of that sort of thing. So yeah, that would be my take.
Well, I don't wish to sound more of a disgusting hippie than I already am, the vegan Buddhist animal rights activist, blah blah blah. blah. But I think a lot of role playing has become very commercialized and very sterile. And a lot of the older, when it comes to the older crowd, they're looking for something that they used to do, whether it be old school White Wolf or old D&D or something. And they've just found it in horror, where they're allowed to prat about a bit more than they would do.
Yeah.
They would do playing with D&D.
I feel like gaming's being torn in kind of two directions. The middle tier companies all seem to be either folding up or getting far too tied to Kickstarters and so on, and then kind of screwing up mentioning their names. And then on the other, so you've got your TSR and maybe a couple of other reasonably big companies. They've usually diversified into board games and so on now as well. The middle tier companies are all suffering, and then at the other end you've got a lot of indie games, and then the indie games are very politicized.
Well, they never used to be.
They never used to be, no, and it's kind of a shame. And while some of them say they're horror games, I in play I tend to find that they don't seem to really evoke horror themes in the same way that the old games did. They're too timid and too
They're kind of been
worried, I think,
sterilized.
about upsetting people. Yeah. I mean, like you said, you had someone. Well, you said you don't want to dwell on it, but you'd put your game sign-up sheet and you say, this is going to contain, dank memes or whatever. So you would hope that people signing up to it would be ready and prepared, and yet occasionally you'll still have people leave the table. It's happened to me a couple of times. And it's I said what this was going to be about up to a point, because you don't want to spoil the plot or anything.
Yeah.
So, if you weren't up for that, why did you come here? Why did you sit down, and why are you being so rude as to disrupt the game now and spoil it for everyone else? So yeah.
And funny enough, my game revolved around a rape, what they got very offended about, and it wasn't like a rape that they walked in on or so on. It was a rape that they kind of walked in on the aftermath of, and they became very offended about that. And I was thinking, I said, my content. I hate to use the word trigger warning, but my content warnings, shall we say? I prefer the term content warning. It's very much, this contains violence, sexual violence, racism, etc., etc. Because when I write horror games, I don't really pull punches unless I think sometimes, we're kind of getting on to the next talking point as well. But it doesn't really matter. This is not really ordered. I think I should be able to go as far as I want to in a horror game, but there's a point where you're just doing it for shock value. There's a point where you're just becoming a Serbian film after a while.
Yeah, and that's different for different groups, and that's another problem with conventions, is in that you don't know these people, you don't know what their limits are, so you can't necessarily plan for that. That best you can do is give content warnings. Now, I differentiate between content warnings and trigger warnings. Trigger warnings seem to me to be hugely specific kind of laundry lists of things that might upset people, whereas content warnings are quite general. There's violence, there's sexual violence, there's drug use or whatever. That's much less specific, and I think for me that's the line between I find content warnings sometimes annoying but okay, but trigger warnings to be counterproductive.
Well, it going off on a slight tangent, it's weird for me because I have not to blow my own trumpet, but I have a degree, a Bachelor of Science degree in mental health, ranging everything from palliative care, death, depression, Alzheimer's, dementia, learning disabilities, etc., etc. And when we use trigger warnings, we use them very carefully, because these are usually things that upset a person to the point of suicide. Or in case of addiction, it can upset them to the point of, getting off the wagon and so forth. So trigger warnings used in such a very liberal sense is a bit of an anathema to me, because when I think of a trigger warning, I think of something that you have to stop someone cutting their wrists from, rather than something that might just upset them a bit.
Is it true then, from your experience, that it's better generally to face the things that upset and trigger you, for want of a better word, to help acclimate yourself to them and stop them having such a strong effect on you? Is that true? Is it worse to keep away from them long term?
It's definitely worse to keep away from them unless you have a certain psychological condition where you're just not going to get over it.
Right.
For example, you could have a rape survivor, like a brutal rape survivor, and eventually they'll get over their fear of men, they'll get over their fear of sex, and so on. But they'll have a heightened sense of fear of rape than other people would.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that would be something you can't really get out of a person. Not all the time. everyone's different. Sometimes.
Could
Yeah,
it
sorry.
possibly be turned around a bit then? Do you think there's a possibility that games could have a therapeutic side use? I mean, there's stories about virtual reality computer games being used to help treat soldiers with PTSD by enabling them to kind of relive the experience. So do you think games could have a kind of a therapeutic effect?
Well, tying into what I said earlier and what we're talking about now, I think games are an art form, or they can be an art form. And let's not delude ourselves here. There are two types of art. There's art that's commercially successful, that's still art, and there's art that's not commercially successful. That is also art. It depends what you're getting into art for. I mean, Picasso and so on never really sold a painting till after his death. Well, never became successful anyway.
Yeah.
So he never got to see the fruits of his labours, etc., etc. But games are, again, the word, a safe space for doing things that you couldn't or wouldn't do in real life. And they've been used. I don't want to go into too much of the research now, but they're looking into games, for example, to treat people who have violent schizophrenia or violent tendencies, or even inklings towards paedophilia, etc., etc. They're using like this virtual reality or gaming side to, and this is all just still in testing at the moment, because gaming is still roughly new to the whole mental health, psychiatry area. Look at me sounding all professional and can't get his words out. But it can be very, very therapeutic in removing, or at least treating, that problem that people have, because it is safe. You can turn the game off and walk away. I would say actually it's true or not true, because a good horror game, for example, you should still be scared of things happening after the game has ended. But
yeah, it should hang over you for a short while afterwards. Yeah.
But the thing is that it eventually dissipates, and the more you expose yourself to that, the more you become acclimatized to it. As I said, I think you can and should be able to do things in games that you can't do anywhere else. I mean, for example, if I'm writing a horror game, I might want to put in crucified fetuses or Nazi death camps or something really extreme. I should be able to put that in there if I want to. But the caveat is that it has to be done well and with respect to the subject matter. And people say, how can you bring respect to the subject matter of crucified fetuses and so on? But there's doing it for shock value and shock value alone, and then there's doing it where it actually becomes part of the world you're creating. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's not like these kind of horrible things don't happen in real life either. Humans can be utterly ghastly to each other. I mean, your crucified fetuses, that could well be a comment. You could use that in horror. I mean, horror is often commentary, so you could use that as commentary on the abortion argument in the States, or religious attitudes towards contraception or something, and then you can work that into your horror narrative. Horror's always been great for doing that, for making comment on things.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I'll give the example of crucified fetuses. A lot of my horror is very religious and very symbolic. Characters in this game were in like a purgatory sort of world, and every place in their backstory was represented in this world as part of a city. And the abortion clinic was a field of crucified babies, with Latin above the crucifixion saying, for those who are without sin.
Mm.
And it took them a while to go, and someone had to bring up like a Latin translator on their phone or something. I prefer, and this is kind of breaking the fourth wall, but I kind of like when players have to work stuff out, even if the character has the skill, because it makes them more involved in the game.
Yeah, it gets a kind of meta level involvement, though it's a tough balance to strike there.
Yeah, but that was okay for the group and for myself, because it had some sort of like artistic merit to the game, to the character experiencing it, to the other characters who didn't really know what was going on. But just like throwing images of dead babies at people, it just doesn't work. All it does is put them off.
Yeah, well, it can work to just kind of throw schlock, but then you're doing something different. You're doing splatterpunk, like Brain Dead, or
Gore
yeah,
porn,
the wave of Japanese sort of B-movie gore films, Tokyo Gore Police, or
MPD Psycho or something.
yeah, things like that. You're doing something different then, in which case you're just going kind of out and out for the disgust, which is fine too. That's okay. But it's a different aim and a different way of applying it.
I think the Japanese do disgust very well. I've had problems with certain creators who, as I said, they just throw the images in there and they're not very well done. It's sort of like they're just like, oh, and here's a dead baby. Are you disgusted? Yes. it's very systematic. It's very. They almost have like the system of jump scare, dead baby,
Yeah.
jump scare, dead baby, and I've got to the point. I watch so much horror and I read so much horror that jump scares no longer work on me, and I can prove it, but not right now. And like disgusting images don't work on me anymore. Like I've seen, not to get morbid, but I've seen real people die, and after that, it's like no, horror just doesn't work.
Yeah, put some work into it.
Yeah,
get good, scrub.
Get good. Get on my level. This is the guy who's only self-published stuff, but there you go. I guess we're going on like the. I guess I'll ask you the question now. I've gone to a bit. It's like how far is too far? Does horror have its limits in any context?
I don't think horror has a limit per se. I think creators have their limits and audiences have their limits. And within a culture at any given point, there is a certain cultural idea of what the limit might be. So if you're creating horror, you have to kind of weigh all these different aspects up and try and sail the edge, because you want to be effective, you want to be genuinely horrifying, but you don't want to turn at least the majority of your audience off. This is actually an advantage tabletop horror has, I think, more so if you know your group, but even if you don't know your group, so long as you can read people's body language and look at their faces and see whether they're okay with what you're doing, you can make it worse, or you can tone it down, or you can skip a particular scene and so on. So you can adapt live to people's reactions, which is good. For example, I had a guy at a table at a con with a horror scenario, which just one minor scene involved a lot of spiders. So I'm in the middle of describing them, and he's kind of turning green. So I ask, "Are you okay? What's up?" I have this really, really harsh phobia of spiders. So I went, "Okay, fine. We'll sort of skip over the rest of the description." And that was okay. Adapting to people who are there who have real problems and are polite and nice about it isn't an issue. But for him, in that situation, I was able to adapt. That was too much for him. Even though a lot of the rest of the scenario was probably a lot grosser to most people, he couldn't handle spiders. So you can adapt to that. So what's too far is something that would break the game, that would make people leave the table. But you've got to have reasonable expectations as a player going into a game that you're going to be challenged, and you've got to have reasonable expectations as a games master going to the table. What can I get away with, and then you can adapt it as you go along. So yeah, I don't think there is a too far per se. It's just too situational for that.
Well, I think you've spoken about this before, but something I was also part of, Camrilla UK.
Yeah.
Back in the day, I stopped playing a long while ago, but we had this the Fade to Black thing, where you just say, okay, this happened, but we don't need to go into detail about it. We just all agree that it happened. And that's one general way of getting around problems with players in the scenario.
Yeah, yeah, we had that as well in our group. That was hardly ever invoked. It was mostly used for sexual content because that made people more uncomfortable than anything else. But it was easy to abuse. In that you're trying to evoke a particular emotional scene for a group of characters, and then someone pipes up, I need to fade to black, and they weren't necessarily really, I don't think, in a position where they had to do that. And the final evolved form of this is these X cards idea we've seen brought up around conventions. I don't want to deal with this, and it can really disrupt play. So it's a constant balance between what's genuinely really okay for the players and courtesy to the GM and effectiveness of the story and so on. And I guess. It sounds arseholey, but my fear is that too much control in that direction has shifted to the hands of the people who would object, and not necessarily on good grounds.
Well, two things I'll say. First of all, one of the points of horror is losing control.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big theme in horror of scenarios that are outside of your control or influence. The second thing is, if you have a problem with these things, why are you signing up to a horror game? There are plenty of games at conventions. You don't have. I'm going to be a bit of a dick about this as well. If you have problems, like if these things are problems for you, and you see a game, like Cult or Cthulhu or something that has like content warnings, don't sign up for it. Don't play it, because there are people who can deal with this fine, and so on, and they should be able to have the game that they want to play as well. It becomes down to one person kind of spoiling it for everyone. And I'm not uncompassionate to people who have legitimate problems, but there comes a point where you're saying, if you're scared of roller coasters, why are you riding them?
Yeah, exactly. Trying to think of a nicer way to put this, I suppose. If you go into a horror game and you feel disgusted or scared or disturbed or something, good. That's the point. Okay, you're supposed to feel uncomfortable. There's a difference between uncomfortable and I can't cope with this. You stick it out as much as you can, and then if it does finally get too much, that's when you object, if you have to object, or you just step away from the table for a minute, or something. Just be considerate of everybody there. People seem to be far too ready and willing to kind of prioritize themselves over everybody else, because a tabletop game is a collective endeavor, and everyone that's there deserves to have a good time.
Well, I was lucky enough at conventions, I'd see the same group of people, going back to who plays horror games. It was like the same group of people who would play, not the same individuals usually, but the same type of individual that would play a horror game. You ranging from the metalheads to the goths and so on and so forth. I'd rarely see what you might call as the stereotypical convention geek at a horror game. I'd rarely see that guy with a D20 T-shirt and the carrying Dungeons and Dragons books and so on. They didn't seem to factor in very much.
No, well, that's a whole separate thing. But it's the kind of people that turn up to a convention where there's all these hundreds of amazing new games and new experiences on offer, and then they just sit at the same table and play Pathfinder all weekend. Seems like a wasted opportunity to me. But I don't care. I have a good time. But it definitely seems to be the different people that go for the horror games.
Yeah. I guess we should go on to one of the last talking points is what do you think the future of horror RPGs is?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. See, technology doesn't make that much of a difference in tabletop gaming. It's still very much the same kinds of tools that we've always had. I think maybe there's a few things that are different in that you've got people with tablets and stuff around the table and so on. So integrating technology seems to be something that's still in its infancy as regards tabletop games, and I think that's because there's not enough money there. But you could use that potentially to increase immersion, so that instead of you having a character sheet, you might just have a description and an equipment list for your character, and all the character information might be on the Games Master's tablet. So all the rules and everything are completely hidden from you as a player. So you're making decisions and deciding what you do purely on the basis of how you feel and want to react in the moment, and then the games master could have all the information and do all the roles for you much more easily. So I think that might be a way of creating a huge degree of immersion. It's something I'd definitely like to experiment with. I just don't know how to go about it. And the other thing is maybe streaming audio is a lot easier now. Everyone's got these multimedia devices on them, so you could have sounds pop out of people's devices and so on while you're playing, and that could shit people right up. And you can create playlists for ambient music and so on. These are all things that can enhance tabletop. The way things have been going overall, system design has been changing a lot. It's been becoming much simpler, much more narrative focused, and you'd think that would be good for horror games, but I'm not 100% convinced that it is, because certainly with survival horror, the grittiness of systems like BRP or of Blood, the Call of Cthulhu, that sort of thing, that lends to that sense of impending doom. What are my resources? What are my chances? You understand them. You have a much better grasp of exactly what your survival chances in any situation, and you're constantly making these survival-oriented decisions. Whereas in a narrative game, it's much less obvious how hurt you are or what your capabilities are. It's harder to gauge how much a wound is really debilitating you and that sort of thing. So bizarrely and paradoxically, I think narrative games are sometimes worse for horror than more what you might call simulationist games, which have a sense of reality. I mean, horror games need to be more lethal, and narrative games tend to be less lethal. So that's something interesting that could be addressed through design and innovation as well.
Yeah, I've tend to seen that in the indie narrative for horror games, where it's very hard to fail. There's no danger to your character, really. There's no danger to the scenario, because it's very, very. It's trying to explain these to maybe people who don't know the type of game we're talking about. The type of game where dice rolls and so forth are not necessarily important. It's how you narrate your actions that make the success or failure. Those type of games where the player gets to do whatever they want regardless of whatever the mechanics say, kind of puts a dampener on horror a bit.
Yeah.
Actually, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you cross compare to computer games, if you think about how in Resident Evil, when you're down to your last clip of ammunition and you're searching every corner, that kind of resource management that lends itself to horror doesn't come in so much with the narrative games, whereas it does with the more mechanically oriented games.
I was actually going to say I'm a bit more doom and gloom about this, unfortunately, but I think that horror, so much traditional horror and RPGs, are moving more towards old school point and click games rather than the pen and paper of horror. I've seen a good few horror games that are point and click, or some might say, walking simulators. I don't necessarily have a problem with walking simulators if they're good. There was one that was brought out recently called Never Ending Nightmares, which I quite enjoy. For its art style, and it's got enough game mechanics to make you remember that it's still a game while you're basically experiencing this kind of nightmare world. Then you have old school games like Sanitarium, and the modern games that there's one brought out recently, I can't remember, it was kind of a big hit, horror, very H.R. Geiger-esque look to it.
No, I don't know.
No, well, yeah, it doesn't matter. I think because of the level of interaction and the fact that larger horror role-playing groups are becoming less of a thing because of the the icon codex cards, Fate Black, etc., that it will very much come down to either singular or cooperative horror games on PC, whether that be point and click or something cooperative where I think it will move more into digital than
Yeah,
paper.
I mean, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to tabletop RPGs. Anyway, I think we need to find better ways to play online. I mean, there are various programs and things that can help you, but there's still quite a big technical blockade in the way, and they tend to be reliant on live sessions. So you get a bunch of people on, say, Google Hangouts, and then you host your game on there. But with that kind of online play, I find difficulties in getting people to commit to turn up to a regular session, and there's always technical difficulties and people dropping out, or the tools don't work or don't load properly for someone. So there's all these hurdles in the way of that, and I think it misses some of the aspects of being able to play online that might actually be better than face-to-face tabletop gaming. Things like asynchronous play, so someone can submit a turn at one point when they've got time free or whatever. So yeah, I've been putting a lot of thought into how to do online play better, whether it be forums, IRC, web chat, or by email. And you look at horror games like Deep Profundus, which is based in Cthulhu mythos and about people sending correspondence to each other about the horrors they're witnessing and so on, and that would translate very well to kind of email play or something like that. So that's the direction it can go potentially.
Yeah, I generally think it would move into more digital spaces than, unfortunately, for conventions anyway.
See, the problem with computer games, point and click or anything else, is that computers still lack the adaptive ability and the subtlety of a human games master. So even in games with fairly complicated sort of morality or faction systems, like say the last Dragon Age, your decisions are still not really that complicated. There's very little nuance to it. You look at the ending of Mass Effect, which is basically a science fiction horror scenario. If you take the whole thing collectively, all these decisions that you make that were supposed to be impactful end up amounting to nothing. And if you look at each decision individually, it's pretty binary. And these are continuing reasons why tabletop role playing has an edge, at least in these aspects over computer gaming. And with horror particularly, a human GM can adapt to you, can step it up or step it down, account for weird actions you might take, whereas a computer game can't help but be railroady.
I think, funnily enough, I do think we'll have like a renaissance, like a horror RPG renaissance, but I don't think in our time. I think horror is something that changes. Horror gets better the more conservative a society gets.
Mm.
Yeah, it does. Horror is one of those like punk, like metal, like anything. The more conservative and centrist a society becomes, the more the extreme pushes back. Should we say?
You'd think it'd be booming right now.
I don't think.
Socially and artistically, our society at the moment is very conservative.
I'd say I'd agree with you, but it's conservative in small pockets. The average, I hate to say the average person in the street, but the average person who doesn't play role-playing games, doesn't play computer games, doesn't read comics, doesn't really know about this. So it's not as widespread. It seems widespread to us because it's in the spheres that we work in. But to everyone else, it's just a non-issue. I think it has to become an issue for them before everything else starts, pushing back.
Maybe you're right.
So I think we will have we will have a renaissance, but maybe in a few years, decades, maybe.
I think horror, like I was describing the ways in which tabletop role playing is better, and I think horror particularly plays into those. In that it can be adaptive, in that it's personal, in the degree of immersion that it can create, despite being limited to the exchange of words and so on. So I think all the things that make tabletop role playing better in some ways than computer gaming or other forms of entertainment are particularly true of horror role playing.
Yeah. I think you just won't get around the creative atmosphere that a couple of people sitting around a table and interacting and evolving the story. You won't beat that for any other type of game, because it's living. if I could use that word, it's a living story that continues to change depending on the group.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking for a good hour, so is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think I'm good on that. Buy my stuff. Shill.
Do you want to plug your stuff? Plug your website.
Postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. Just go there. That's my central hub for everything that I do. So, go there, follow the links, buy stuff. Woohoo!
Great. And I no longer sell my stuff because it's kind of crap, and I only used to sell it at conventions for charity anyway. So you can't buy any of my stuff, and if you've got it, you're lucky because it's now limited edition. Well, thank you very much, James Grimm Desborough.
Thank you, Roo. You can keep up with what I'm doing at postmortemstudios.wordpress.com, which also has links to everywhere that I sell my products. You can also keep up with me on Twitter at Grimachu, and if you would care to support my work, you can support me at Patreon, again at Grimachu. Anything you give there will be used to better future further projects. Thanks.